locked in a dark ward at Pennhurst State School. The air hangs heavy with the putrid odor of human waste and echoes with the screams of the poor souls confined there. In 1965, a journalist described a living nightmare inside this institution. Grown men and women left to sit naked on wooden benches in barren rooms, doing nothing but waiting to return to bed. Nearby, other adults spent their days strapped into cribs like infants, some of them so neglected that they had regressed to a vegetable state of existence. This was a real place in the United States, in the state of Pennsylvania, operating in the mid-20th century under the guise of a state school and hospital for the sake of society's most vulnerable. The horrors of Pennhurst Insane Asylum. That's how it's become known, and it was all too real. So today, we're going to talk about Pennhurst State School and Hospital, or rather, Pennhurst Insane Asylum, depending on what gentle name or infamous name you want to apply. And I think you'll find that by the end, the story is much darker than you think. Continuing, of course, from our series on this channel about American insane asylums, which you can find in the playlists. I hope you're enjoying it. Now, allow me to welcome you. If you are new to the channel, I invite you to click the subscribe button, and then you won't miss out on all of the other videos we do. And leave a like and a comment too. Make sure other people have the opportunity to see it in the algorithm. And speaking of enjoying videos like this video and every other video on this channel in the playlists are all ad-free. You won't get interrupted in the middle of it, so whether you're going to sleep or you're just listening intently, you won't have any ads coming up to disturb your experience. This is possible because we are funded by the Patreon members, the YouTube members, the people who visited the merch store with all the mugs and t-shirts and all the rest, and the occasional donation on Super Thanks, and the PayPal link. If you want to find any of those, you can look in the pinned comment, the video description, or just in the channel description on the front page. Now, welcome's out of the way and introduction said and done. Let's get nice and relaxed, because today we go back into another American asylum. Ooh. Of course, Pennhurst didn't emerge out of nowhere, but rather it was, like many of the other asylums at the time, born out of an era of grand but somewhat misguided social engineering. When it opened in 1908, as it was originally called, Eastern Pennsylvania State Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic. Couldn't have found a longer name, I suppose. Progressive-era reformers hailed it as a humane solution for those deemed unfit for polite society. Influential physicians like Dr. Martin Barr championed the idea of perpetual segregation for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, believing this would protect both the individuals but also the wider public. In truth, these beliefs were steeped in the pseudoscience of eugenics, the notion that social ills could be cured by preventing the feeble-minded from reproducing, and by, of course, just shoving them into a little corner, keeping them out of sight. These are terms that we recoil from today. Things like defective. They were commonly used by officials to justify placing children and adults in institutions just like Pennhurst. The early 20th century saw a nationwide boom in such facilities, each typically isolated in the countryside and designed, at least outwardly, like a stately campus. Pennhurst itself sprawled over 1,400 acres near Spring City, Pennsylvania, with red brick buildings connected by graceful lawns, and even a network of underground tunnels. To the public eye, Pennhurst might have looked like a peaceful boarding school, or a self-contained village, certainly a far cry from the horror it would become known for. From the beginning, however, there were more than a few ominous signs. First of all, sterilization was quietly practiced at Pennhurst in the early decades, reflecting the overall eugenic attitudes. Contemporary accounts indicate that many Pennhurst doctors believed in sterilizing patients for their own good. And of course, these procedures were performed without consent. This was a pretty obvious human rights violation, but it was allowed to continue for decades. Men and women in the institution were strictly segregated, not only for behavioral reasons, but primarily to prevent any chance of reproduction. In effect, Pennhurst embraced the role of policing the genetics of its inmates. It wasn't enough that they were locked away. The powers that be also wanted to ensure that they would have no descendants. Ironically, even this draconian separation did not ensure safety. It didn't do anything to stop incidents of SA by staff or others in the male wards, which later became a dreadful facet of Pennhurst's routine abuses. The early emphasis on eugenics and control planted the seeds of a culture that treated patients not as individuals with rights, but rather just problems to be managed at any cost, and eventually, through the passage of time, eliminated completely. Yet in its public mission, Pennhurst touted itself as both a school and a hospital, suggesting that residents would receive training, medical care, and education. And for a time, yes, there were indeed workshops, a farm. They even had a band and a choir for residents. The administrators optimistically spoke of teaching, quote, imbecile children basic skills, and perhaps returning some to society as useful workers, albeit in, shoehorned capacities. This thin veneer of benevolence, however, soon wore off. The population grew rapidly, overshooting capacity almost immediately. Originally designed to house about 500 inmates, Pennhurst was filled to capacity within a few years, and the state kept sending more people. By 1914, it already held over 500 residents, and by mid-century, it was bursting at the seams. The average stay stretched on for decades, often a lifetime, effectively thrown in there for a life sentence if you were unlucky enough to be committed. Well, many families who sent a child to Pennhurst in the 20s or the 30s were led to believe that this was the best, or in some cases the only option. Of course, the heartbreaking reality was that few ever came back out. During the Great Depression and the Second World War, resources were scarce, but institutions like Pennhurst continued to expand as dumping grounds for anyone society just didn't know how to deal with. Children with developmental disabilities, adults with epilepsy or psychiatric disorders, even some who were simply unwanted or orphaned, they all got sent to Pennhurst. And by the early 50s, the institution's census had skyrocketed. In 54, it reached 3,550 residents, far beyond what its facilities could sustain humanely. And the numbers just kept climbing. In the 1960s, they peaked at well over 4,000 people crammed into the wards, and this made Pennhurst one of the largest institutions of its kind in the United States. Behind the soaring admission numbers lay countless personal tragedies. Families who had been told to place their child and move on with their lives, or poor and disabled individuals effectively abandoned the state care. Pennhurst's population boom reflected a time when institutionalization was a mainstream practice. And here's a bit of trivia for you. Even President John F. Kennedy's own sister had been placed in an institution after a failed lobotomy, a fact not revealed publicly until 1962, and it was a private institution, but still, that's a pretty interesting little fact there, especially since the lobotomy effectively turned her into a breathing shell of a human. In any case, the stigma of disability and mental illness, combined with the advice of many doctors, funneled thousands into places like Pennhurst. Crucially, funding and staffing never kept pace with this explosion of population. By the 1950s, Pennhurst had become a vast warehouse, with little pretense of cure or education. The state allocated only minimal budgets, and as patient numbers rose, conditions just got worse and worse. The very design of Pennhurst's system, a closed-off world subject to few outside eyes, allowed neglect and abuse to flourish unchecked. And it is inside those pretty, well-designed brick buildings, well out of the public view, that a human catastrophe was about to take place. By the mid-20th century, the institution had devolved from its reformist origins into something truly nightmarish. The signs that things were not right were evident to anybody who looked at even a cursory glance, though for years, few actually did. In November 1952, one case briefly pierced the veil of secrecy. A 29-year-old resident named Robert Beers died, and Pennhurst listed it as a heart attack. Well, the problem was, when his family came to collect the body, they found it covered in bruises and cuts. And, well, you don't really get that from a heart attack, don't you? And here's the other thing. Beers was an African American, and his outraged parents refused to accept the official explanation. They demanded answers, and their persistence triggered an FBI investigation into the possibility of civil rights violations. Now, this was highly unusual. Rarely did federal authorities pry into a state institution's affairs. Pennsylvania's governor at the time bristled at the scrutiny, fearing it might set a precedent for thousands more investigations into prisons and asylums. So the incident was largely hushed up. No one was held accountable for Beer's suspicious death. But it was an early warning. Behind Pennhurst's walls, terrible things could happen with impunity. Tragedy struck again and again in the 50s, often amplified by the institution's gross overcrowding and mismanagement. In 1953, hepatitis ripped through Pennhurst in an uncontrolled outbreak. The entire campus went under a quarantine that lasted months, and the virus infected 425 people. A few years later, in 1957, an influenza epidemic killed 20 residents and sickened hundreds more. Investigators revealed Pennhurst had failed to inoculate many patients against the flu. These failed public health disasters hinted at deeper negligence. In fact, scholars later rediscovered that Pennhurst had been used as an experimental laboratory for infectious disease research. Doctors with fundings from federal agencies and corporations had deliberately injected residents with live viruses in the 40s and 50s to study the vaccines. Human experimentation, effectively. These residents captive, and often unable to give informed consent, were essentially treated like human guinea pigs. Such experiments were part of a broader pattern of devaluation. It could happen only in a place where patients' dignity and rights meant little to those in charge. Everyday life at Pennhurst during these years was bleak, even when disease and violence wasn't flaring up. Chronic overcrowding and understaffing meant basic care and needs were, pretty much unmet. By 1955, the on-site population officially hit about 3,500, and even a little higher if one counts its satellite facilities. Dormitories and wards, meant for dozens, held several times that number. A single nurse or aide might be responsible for 40 or 50 residents at a time, an impossible ratio. The superintendent himself pleaded for more funds and staff as early as 65, describing severe overcrowding in dire terms. But the government does what it does best, and that is nothing. The state officials were slow to respond. Institutionalized people had very little political voice, and taxpayers were seldom eager to pour money into facilities for the feeble-minded. What was the result? You could only call it profound neglect. No other terms. Many residents were simply warehoused with no active treatment or education at all. They sat idly in day rooms, or lay in their beds for years, stagnating. One young woman's experience shows this. Admitted as a child, with a few words in her vocabulary, she lost even the ability to become totally non-verbal. She lost even those, rather, and became totally non-verbal after years at Pennhurst. The environment was so barren of stimulation and proper care that it actually caused residents to lose basic skills that they once had. The physical conditions within Pennhurst buildings, too, after many years became grossly unsanitary. Insiders in the early 60s spoke of, quote, disgraceful and disgusting conditions. In some wards, paint peeled from the walls, floors were slick with urine, and the smell of excrement never left. Cockroaches and other vermin were infesting in the dorms, and even crawled over the sleeping patients at night. A group of employees attempting to unionize in 1968 blew the whistle on these conditions, reporting that mice and cockroaches crawl over everyone in their beds. Can only imagine that. I hate cockroaches. Not scared of mice, but I hate cockroaches. Our food was often insufficient and of poor quality, and mealtimes could be chaotic, with too few staff to help those who needed assistance eating. Patients who could not feed themselves sometimes went hungry or subsisted on cold puree slopped into their mouths. Basic hygiene was similarly deficient. With so many people to bathe and change, many languished in filthy clothes or urine-soaked sheets for hours or days. A state inspection in the 60s found grossly inadequate laundry facilities and patients wearing dirty, ill-fitting rags. And then, of course, there was the winter, where some wards were completely unheated, leaving profoundly disabled residents shivering under thin blankets. Abuse, physical, emotional, it all thrived in this atmosphere of chaos. Overwhelmed and undertrained attendants resorted to cruel methods to maintain control. Restraints were ubiquitous. It was commonplace to see patients tied to their beds or benches with straight jackets, cuffs, or even improvised straps. Anything just to stop them from moving around. Tranquilizing drugs were handled out of, not as therapy, but a convenient way to sedate difficult residents into submission. One common practice was to dose patients with psychotropic drugs until they became virtually immobile, easier to manage in large numbers. Such chemical control sometimes reached grotesque extremes. In one documented case, a girl who was capable of walking was restrained in a wheelchair and a straitjacket for 9 years, purely because staff did not want to monitor her movements. Over time, she lost her ability to walk and became severely physically deconditioned, a tragic decline caused by the care of Pennhurst. And this was not an isolated incident. The files of the later Pennhurst court case bulged with dozens of similar stories. Parents would visit, only to find their loved ones covered in bruises, cuts, and scars, and the staff, conveniently, had no idea what they were. They couldn't explain them, or they wouldn't explain them. Complaints were usually shrugged off, if not outright ignored. Sometimes the abuse was brutally direct. There are reports of attendants beating patients, sometimes with objects like belts or wooden sticks. In one account from the 1970s, a staff member with a heavy shackle belt struck a resident viciously that left deep welts. Another resident recounted being picked up and thrown several feet across a room by an enraged attendant. When such incidents came to light, the individual staff might be quietly fired, but the systematic issues remained. The prevalence of these accounts is very significant because it shows a pattern of brutality, rather than just a few bad actors. And indeed, Pennhurst was so understaffed and poorly supervised that opportunities for abuse were everywhere. Residents could not speak, or the ones who lacked credibility were especially easy targets. They could be hurt or terrorized, and no one would believe or listen to them if they tried to complain. One of the most grotesque behavioral management tactics at Pennhurst was dental extraction as punishment. According to later court testimony, it was routine for staff to deal with residents who bit others by pulling their teeth out. Children who bit were not given therapy or chewing guards. Instead, the staff just pulled out their teeth, often without any pain relief during the procedure. Can only imagine how barbaric that was. Of course, it left several residents toothless at young ages. Dehumanization at work. The attitudes of these individuals did not even merit basic human treatment in medical care. Medieval stuff. But to them it was an easy way to solve behavioral problems from the staff's perspective, utterly ignoring the suffering inflicted. By the 60s, conditions at Pennhurst had deteriorated so far that even some who had supported institutionalization began calling the place hell. You can't get much of a more effective word than that. But it is worth noting that this time there was a broader shift happening. More middle-class families armed with higher expectations and greater visibility had relatives at Pennhurst. They expected better conditions and were increasingly horrified by what they were seeing. Moreover, some staff and volunteers, including conscientious objectors to the Vietnam War, who worked in such institutions as alternative service, witnessed the neglect and sounded alarms in their communities. Thus, both from inside and outside, pressure was finally starting to build. Of course, there had to be a tipping point, and that came in the mid-1960s, when the journalists finally pulled back the curtain. October 1965, the local newspaper, the Pottstown Mercury, circulating near Pennhurst, ran a searing multi-part exposé that branded Pennhurst as a, quote, living nightmare and a hell hidden behind a pleasant boarding school look. The series of articles by reporter Andrew D. Cook bore lurid details like dirty naked men and women seethe in turmoil of clouded minds, and an overcrowded dumping ground. Pennhurst is hell. I can only imagine the bosses of Pennhurst arriving at their desks Monday morning and reading that over the first coffee. Probably need a few more coffees after that one, wouldn't you? In any case, Cook was not mincing words describing what he saw. One installment painted a picture of empty lives in which people, little elevated from the vegetable state, simply exist day to day, receiving virtually no education or therapy. The Mercury published photographs that shocked readers. One image showed a row of pale, unclothed men with identical buzz-cut hair, packed together on benches in a barren day room. According to the caption, these men were entirely naked, though the photo did crop out most of their bodies, and they were doing nothing except sitting in a stupor waiting for bedtime. In another photo, several adult men, described pointedly as grown men, were shown lying and rocking in crib beds, cage-like, in a ward filled with much of the same beds lined up. The caption noted the ward was filled with the putrid odor of human waste and the screams and moans of those men. These images and words, splashed across the Mercury's pages, were the first real look into Pennhurst that the general public had ever really gotten. And, well, they did not like it. They were deeply disturbed, and rightly so. The Mercury series aimed its outrage not only at Pennhurst's administrators, but at the general public and state legislatures. In scathing editorials, the paper admonished the general public's careless attitude, suggesting that Pennhurst's nightmare was a reflection of society's prejudice and apathy towards people with intellectual disabilities. And yeah, it's hard to argue against that, isn't it? But it also hammered Harrisburg, the state government, highlighting how budget cuts and penny pinching had starved Pennhurst of resources. One Mercury editorial declared bluntly, "It is almost purely a financial problem," noting that better care required more money and more staff, and the lawmakers were just not providing it. Well, the series was more than just journalism. It became a crusade. The newspaper took the unusual step of printing special broadsheet reprints of all of the Pennhurst exposé articles and mailed them directly to every member of the Pennsylvania legislature. Its aggressive tactic worked, at least initially. They were embarrassed by the negative publicity, and the state officials scrambled to respond. Within weeks, a bipartisan group of legislators visited Pennhurst, and the state welfare secretary convened a Blue Ribbon Commission to investigate in January of 1966. They even approved an emergency appropriation of $1 million for Pennhurst, which doesn't sound like much, but in 1966 it was quite a lot. Not to start addressing the worst deficiencies, hopefully this sum would certainly start making some progress. And for a moment, it seemed that public shame might prompt real reform. At least it seemed like that. Some improvements did follow, let's be fair. The infusion of funds in 1966 allowed Pennhurst to hire a few more members of staff, and of course to make minor upgrades. The state also pledged to transfer several hundred of the most severely disabled residents out to private nursing homes and other facilities to relieve the overcrowding. In the fall of '66, Pennsylvania passed a new Mental Health and Mental Retardation Act, which theoretically committed the state to providing adequate services in the least restrictive setting. The Mercury and disability advocates heralded this as a major victory, proof that public exposure of injustice could spur change. Yet these measures were tragically inadequate. Within a couple of years, it was evident that the cosmetic changes barely scratched the surface. And by 1968, Pennhurst still housed well over 3,000 people, and in conditions that remained dangerously inadequate and poor. Disillusioned employees and dedicated parents began to say that only more drastic action would force lasting change. In July of 1968, a second bombshell hit the public, a television broadcast that seared Pennhurst's horrors into the consciousness of Philadelphians. A young TV reporter, Bill Baldini of WCAU, Philadelphia's NBC affiliate, had managed, after persistent negotiation, to get permission to film inside Pennhurst. Over 5 consecutive nights, his investigative report, Suffer the Little Children, aired on local TV, and it was nothing short of explosive. Viewers were shown footage from within Pennhurst that was almost unbearable to watch. Baldini's camera captured scenes of extreme neglect. Nearly naked children and teenagers with intellectual disabilities lying restrained in cribs, some of them wailing or rocking back and forth. Their limbs were bound by leather straps so they couldn't climb out or harm themselves, but it also meant that they could barely move. In one segment, Baldini walked through a ward where a staff member casually explained that many children were kept in cribs all day long because there weren't enough attendants to supervise them if they were up. The camera panned over to the children with vacant eyes, some of whom had been effectively raised in these cribs, never receiving education or adequate human contact. The scenes were heartbreaking. One toddler-aged child with Down syndrome stood pressed against the side of a crib, arms reaching out, begging for attention as the reporter passed by. In another room, teenage boys, wearing nothing but diapers, sat listlessly on the floor amid grime, some with flies crawling on their skin. Baldini's narration was deliberately minimal and somber. He let the images speak the loudest. Occasionally he added some commentary. One quote was, "This boy has been in this crib since he was 1 year old. He's now 17. The title, Suffer the Little Children, showed the biblical irony, a reference to Jesus' words to care for children, set against the reality that those children were suffering immensely every day. The impact of Baldini's exposé on the public was immediate and profound. Never before had so many people seen with their own eyes the kind of abuse that was going on inside an American institution. Letters and calls poured into the TV station and to state officers, expressing horror and demanding action. The public outcry grew louder. Importantly, Baldini's reports also gave further cover and energy to advocacy groups like the Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children, or PARC for short. They had already begun gathering evidence for Pennhurst's failures, led by passionate activists such as Dennis Haggerty, a parent whose own son had been mistreated there. After the exposé, the PARC members were galvanized. America was finally paying attention. But still, some of the most disturbing truths were yet to be publicly aired. In late 1968, PARC learned of a pattern of sexualized violence within Pennhurst that was truly appalling. Through informants, including some sympathetic staff, they documented that assaults were occurring on a nightly basis in the institution. A typical scenario involves stronger residents, often those with mild disabilities or mental illnesses, who might have been institutionalized for behavioral issues, preying on the more defenseless residents. Male residents were often both the perpetrators and the victims, though there were even reports of staff members and outside construction workers coming in to commit SA on the premises. In particular, Pennhurst's notorious network of underground tunnels was cited as a danger zone. Attackers would often drag victims into the tunnels or hide there, knowing they were dimly lit and seldom patrolled. So you can scarcely imagine the scenario. Vulnerable individuals, some non-verbal or physically helpless, trapped in an institution where even the shadowy corridors held terror, where no authority could protect them. Attendants were aware of much of this. Of course, how could they not be, given the frequency? But higher administrators largely turned a blind eye to it. After all, acknowledging the abuse would mean admitting how uncontrolled and dangerous Pennhurst had become. As for the PARC, they faced a dilemma. Now they had the information. How were they going to use it? Of course, they were afraid that if they went public, the leadership in Pennhurst and perhaps even some government members would clamp down and punish the informants, or even the victims, without actually fixing anything. And so, in November of 1968, PARC took a cautious step, issuing a press release that spoke in general terms about the serious problems at Pennhurst, including the abuse, without detailing the worst of it. They hoped this would prod officials to investigate while protecting their sources. But unfortunately, Pennsylvania's government still dragged its feet. It was as if the state were paralyzed by the scope of the problem, unwilling or perhaps unable to move in a decisive manner. Meanwhile, the tragedies at Pennhurst continued, completely unabated, showing once again how very little had actually changed. In the fall of 1968, Joseph Crispo, a 22-year-old resident, was brought to a hospital with severe injuries after what Pennhurst claimed was a bad fall. Oh yeah, come on, no one believes that. It's their excuse every time, isn't it? In any case, but insiders told advocates that Crispo had actually been beaten savagely, either by staff or another resident, and that the fall story was just a cover-up. Another man, Joseph Jaggers, 38, similarly suffered traumatic injuries under suspicious circumstances surrounding the same time. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching story was that of John Stark Williams, a teenager at Pennhurst. His mother, Inez Williams Gant, was a poor African-American woman in North Philadelphia who, despite her limited means, tried to visit her son when she could. On November 4th, 1968, she traveled by a special bus arranged by advocates, since Pennhurst was far outside the city, to see John. She waited outside for 3 hours, only to be told at the end of the day that her son was not there. But the truth was, John had died 10 months earlier in January. So imagine the shock and grief of that moment. Pennhurst had never even told her that her child had fell ill and died. And to make it worse, and this is the most horrifying thing, Pennhurst hadn't given him a proper burial, but rather they sent John's body to a medical school for research without his family's permission. It's unbelievable, isn't it? Well, you have to believe it because it actually happened, but in any case, by the time Miss Gant had learned the truth, John's remains were so experimented on and cut up into little pieces that they were in no condition to be viewed. The family managed to reclaim his body by only paying a fee to the medical school. John's stepfather told a reporter that Pennhurst had disposed of the boy like he was an animal. A callous disregard for human life, using that body as a cadaver and even failing to notify kin. That epitomizes the dehumanization of Pennhurst residents. And so by the end of the 60s, the evidence was undeniable. Pennhurst was a deep well of suffering and abuse. It had become, in effect, a house of horrors operated by the state themselves. Media exposés and internal reports had documented every manner of atrocity: physical abuse, filth, negligence, medical cruelty, bureaucratic indifference, and all the rest. Incremental reforms had clearly failed. The problems at Pennhurst were just too entrenched. So some reformers began to say the unthinkable. Perhaps Pennhurst should not be fixed. Just shut the whole place down. Throw it into the dustbin of history. And of course, that set the stage for a new phase. A legal battle that would drag on for years, but which would ultimately wrest the fate of Pennhurst out of the hands of defensive state officials and into the hands of the courts. So by 1970, it was pretty apparent that only drastic action was going to address the horrors at Pennhurst. No more messing around, no more letter writing. Pennsylvania's own efforts had been halting and insufficient, and hundreds of people remained trapped in intolerable conditions. Advocates therefore turned to a powerful new strategy: federal civil rights litigation. Bold idea. If the state would not protect the rights and lives of Pennhurst's residents, well, perhaps the United States Constitution could be invoked to do so. Now, this was unprecedented legal territory. After all, the people at Pennhurst were not convicted criminals, but individuals with disabilities, many of them put under state care by their families or courts for supposed benefit. So the question was, could the courts recognize that they had fundamental rights to humane treatment and safety? The first major lawsuit in this vein was actually not specific to Pennhurst, actually. In 1971, a case known as Pennsylvania Association for Retarded Children versus Pennsylvania challenged the exclusion of children with disabilities from public schools, and helped establish that children with intellectual disabilities also have a right to an education. This was part of the broader disability rights awakening. Building on that momentum, PARC's leadership voted in 1969 to explore a lawsuit specifically about Pennhurst. In 74, with the situation at Pennhurst still dire, the lawsuit was ready. It was filed as a class action on behalf of all Pennhurst residents, with a young attorney named David Fairlager taking up the case. The lead plaintiff was identified as Terry Lee Haldeman, a young woman who had been injured and regressed under Pennhurst's care. Thus, the case became known as Haldeman versus Pennhurst. It sued not only the institution but also the state officials responsible for it, alleging a large list of constitutional and statutory violations: cruel and unusual punishment, denial of due process and equal protection, and violations of newly minted disability rights laws in Pennsylvania. At its core, the lawsuit argued that Pennhurst residents had a right to habilitation, meaning training and care, in safe, non-degrading conditions, and that warehousing them in a place like Pennhurst violated their fundamental human rights. The Haldeman case dragged through the courts for years, but crucially it brought Pennhurst's reality into a courtroom, and thus into official written record. A 32-day trial was held in 1977 before U.S. District Judge Raymond J. Broderick, who personally toured Pennhurst during the proceedings. Witnesses testified to appalling conditions, many of which we've already detailed, so we won't go over them again. Families recounted how their children and siblings were healthy or manageable before, but once they were inside Pennhurst, they only deteriorated. Former staff and experts described the overcrowding, the filth, and the violence. The plaintiffs built an unassailable case that Pennhurst was not providing rehabilitation or care at any meaningful level. In 1977, Judge Broderick issued a sweeping verdict in favor of the Pennhurst residents. His findings were a damning indictment. Pennhurst, he concluded, was overcrowded, understaffed, and lacked the programs needed for adequate habilitation. Unwarranted restraints were used in lieu of proper staffing and therapy. People were tied down or drugged because there was no one to tend to them otherwise. The physical environment was hazardous, both psychologically and physically. Broderick wrote that it was so poor that it actually caused residents to lose skills they had previously acquired. And importantly, he confirmed that residents were subjected to abuse by staff and other residents at an unacceptable level. I mean, there's no acceptable level, isn't there? In one chilling line, the judge noted that, quote, Pennhurst is not only dangerous, but residents, often physically abused or drugged by staff, but it is also a place of psychological cruelty. In essence, the court recognized that Pennhurst violated the very constitutional rights of the people that were locked inside of it. Judge Broderick's legal conclusions were groundbreaking. He ruled that once the state confines a person in an institution, it has to provide at least a minimally adequate level of care and habilitation. Something Pennhurst, of course, utterly failed to do. But he also held that residents had a right to be free from harm, and that is a right grounded in the Eighth Amendment's prohibition of cruel and unusual punishment and the 14th Amendment's guarantees. And crucially, he said that keeping people with disabilities segregated in such a miserable place, when they could be served in the community, was a form of discrimination, violating equal protection. Or this concept, that separate was inherently unequal in the context of disability, echoed the logic of Brown versus the Board of Education, extending it beyond race to the realm of disability rights. So Broderick issued a bold remedy. He ordered Pennhurst to close, and all his residents be offered suitable community living arrangements with adequate support. He even appointed a special monitor to oversee the process of deinstitutionalization. It was effectively a court-ordered liberation of over 1,000 people from a nightmare institution, and at the time this was heralded as a landmark victory for the rights of people with disabilities, a recognition that they should not be out of sight, out of mind, subjected to what amounted to torture in state facilities. However, this isn't happily ever after. The story didn't quite end there. Pennsylvania's officials resisted the ruling, balking at the cost and perhaps the affront to their authority. The case went through multiple appeals, and in the early 80s, the U.S. Supreme Court weighed in twice on narrower legal issues, not on the facts of abuse, which were by then undisputed, but on federal-state jurisdiction and immunity questions. Those Supreme Court decisions in 1981-1984 became infamous in legal circles for limiting federal power. One decision, Pennhurst 1, that's how they name it in legal context, made it harder to use federal laws to hold states accountable. And another, Pennhurst 2, shielded states from certain lawsuits by invoking the 11th Amendment's sovereign immunity. In fact, Justice Thurgood Marshall's anguished dissent in one of these later rounds is where he wrote that Pennhurst's regime of state-mandated segregation and degradation, quote, rivaled the worst features of Jim Crow. Marshall was furious that procedural doctrines might let Pennsylvania evade responsibility after what had been proven about Pennhurst. Pretty much, they were going to get away with it because of some legal loophole. But you can imagine how people would be quite annoyed about that, right? Who would have thought that the government would be corrupt to save their own skin? But ultimately, the factual findings of abuse were never overturned, and significantly, Pennsylvania did not try to deny those findings. By the 80s, virtually everyone conceded that Pennhurst was indefensible. And so finally, after a decade of litigation, the state agreed to settle. In 1984, a settlement was reached that essentially affirmed Judge Broderick's mandate. Pennhurst would be closed, and its residents moved to small community-based settings with appropriate services. The closure process was complex and gradual, of course, but it did move forward, piece by piece. By 1986, only a few hundred people remained at Pennhurst, and on December 9th, 1987, Pennhurst shut its doors for good, after nearly 79 years of operation. More than 1,100 surviving residents were dispersed to group homes, special living arrangements, or other facilities closer to their home communities, with individualized plans to support each one of them. Many of these former residents, once written off as hopeless, actually thrived in the community when given proper care, learning skills, enjoying freedoms, and living in far more humane conditions. Of course, the end of Pennhurst was, I guess you could say, it's a watershed moment. It demonstrated that even the most entrenched institution could be dismantled when its injustice became overwhelmingly clear. But it also signaled the dawn of the deinstitutionalization movement for people with developmental disabilities across the entire country. No longer would large, prison-like asylums be seen as acceptable warehouses for the disabled. Those days were coming to an end. But it's crucial to note that even as the legal victory was being won, abuse at Pennhurst did not cease overnight. In the 1980s, a few remaining staff were actually criminally indicted for abusing patients, showing that cruelty persisted right up to the final chapter. It was as if it was built into the foundation of the building itself. One New York Times article in November of 1983 reported on several Pennhurst employees charged with beating and mistreating residents. Of course, the whole culture was not going to go away with a judge's gavel falling. And even the world watching, and the institution days were numbered, some individuals continued those old ways. Perhaps they felt untouchable. Or maybe they were just unable to change their behavior. In any case, these late-breaking incidents likely hastened the urgency to close the facility and remove the residents to safety. It was as if Pennhurst, to its last gasp, could not escape the toxic dynamic that had defined it for decades. But of course, eventually it did close. And with it, also closed one of the darkest chapters in American medical history. For the survivors and their families, the scars were deep and lasting. Many former residents bore physical marks, scars from restraints, untreated medical conditions, disabilities aggravated by years of neglect. And then there's the scars you can't see, the psychological trauma, even more pervasive. Individuals who had spent years or lifetimes at Pennhurst had to adjust to freedom, which was both as joyous as it was frightening. Some never fully recovered from the regression and abuse they experienced, requiring intensive support in their new homes. Families, too, carried guilt or grief. Some had entrusted their loved ones to Pennhurst in good faith, only to later learn of the horror that had transpired. Pennhurst physical campus, the picturesque expanse of early 20th century buildings, didn't just get demolished in 1987 either. For years it stood abandoned, a crumbling monument of shame. Nature began to overtake. Graffiti and vandalism left scars on the infrastructure. And there was a debate in the local community and among advocates about what to do with the place. Some felt it ought to be demolished entirely, thrown away like a bad memory. Others believed it should have been preserved as a memorial or museum to remind those future generations of how bad things can get. much as one preserves the site of a tragedy as a historical lesson. The debate took a controversial turn, however, in the late 2000s, when a private developer bought the property and, to the dismay of many, turned it into a bit of a haunted asylum attraction for Halloween entertainment. The attraction, literally marketed as Pennhurst Haunted Asylum, invited guests to walk through the old wards for thrills. Many disability advocates and families of the former residents were deeply offended by this. They argued that Pennhurst was not a fun house of ghost stories, but a real site of human tragedy. To turn into a macabre entertainment seemed to trivialize the pain of thousands. Well, debate continues on the issue. Some claim that the haunted house at least keeps the site from being demolished, and notes it includes a museum section that tells a true history, while opponents see it as a ghoulish disrespect. But in 2010, as if to reclaim the narrative, the state and advocates erected a historical marker on the Pennhurst grounds, officially recognizing it as an important site in both Pennsylvanian and American history. And the marker doesn't celebrate Pennhurst, of course, but rather it commemorates the civil rights struggle of those who emerged from it, and is now listed as an international site of conscience, a designation for places with dark pasts preserved to educate others. Through archives, oral histories, and the efforts of the Pennhurst Memorial and Preservation Alliance, the stories of its former residents are being recorded. And I think we've done our bit today to make sure that they are not forgotten. Well, thank you very much for listening. I'm going to thank the top-tier patrons and supporters: Kimberly, Christine, Sally, Ember, Susan, Cameron, Gary, Charlene, Lynn, Therese, Katiana, Nicholas, Ulfanir, Alexander, Charles, Christine, Dr. Neuronerd, Aaron, Jaden, Jim, Jeffrey, Jessica, Madeline, Melissa, Orthodox Review, Scott, Shell, Wendy, Josie, Sarah, Ryan, Thor, Cameron, Stephen, Kevin, HMSHH, Crystal, Talbury, Anthony, Lucy, Brandon, Gugu Bubonic, Nicholas, Craig, Neftis, Alexander, Gokhan, Dorsey, Benita, Claire, Courtesy, Carol, Robert, Mary, Bridget, Nefertari, Yvette, Miss Mochi, 11, Allison, Free American, Jennifer, Brittany, David, Cody, Brian, Are You My Mum, Rhonda, Carrie, Catty P, and Lovely. Alright, that's it. Well, if you've enjoyed it, go and tell your friends, go and click the subscribe button, all that good stuff. Alright, that's enough for me. I will see you when you feel like you are inclined to return. Lots of love to you all, and drink plenty of water or something. Good night, everyone.